In September 2014, a small group of hunters was exploring a remote, densely wooded area located roughly 19 miles from their hometown. As they moved carefully through the thick forest, they made an unsettling discovery. Hidden deep within a cluster of dense bushes, partially obscured by heavy foliage, lay an unusually placed large bucket. Intrigued, yet wary, the hunters decided to investigate further. As he looked inside, a sense of dread immediately overcame him. To his shock and horror, he realized that the bucket contained gruesome and horrifying evidence. The chilling contents left the group deeply shaken, prompting them to immediately contact the authorities for assistance. Law enforcement officers responded promptly, quickly securing and preserving the scene for a thorough investigation. Specialists meticulously recovered the evidence and transported them for detailed forensic examination. After extensive analysis, including comparisons with dental records, forensic experts conclusively identified the victim as Holly Bobo. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this documentary, we will explore the true crime story of Holly Lynn Bobo, who was born on October 12, 1990, in a quaint, serene American town named Darden, Tennessee. This charming place, nestled in the heart of Tennessee's countryside, had a tranquil atmosphere and was home to just a few hundred residents who cherished their close-knit community and slow-paced lifestyle. Surrounded by lush forests, picturesque hills, and winding creeks, Darden felt like an idyllic haven, far removed from the hustle and bustle of bigger cities. Holly grew up in this peaceful setting with her parents and her older brother, who shared her appreciation for nature and the great outdoors. The Bobo family deeply valued their time together, regularly embarking on family adventures, whether it was hiking through shaded trails, fishing in crystal-clear streams, or cooling off in local creeks on hot summer days. Their family bond was strong, built upon shared experiences and mutual support. Beyond her love of nature, Holly had a passion for music, especially singing. Her melodious voice often resonated during local church services, bringing joy and comfort to the congregation. Friends and family admired her kindness, warmth, and talent, predicting that she would accomplish wonderful things in life. Following her graduation from high school, Holly was determined to pursue a meaningful and impactful career in healthcare. Her compassionate nature guided her toward nursing, and she enrolled at the University of Tennessee's campus in a neighboring town to fulfill her dreams. By 2011, at the age of 20, Holly was deeply engaged in her academic pursuits, dedicating herself fully to becoming a nurse who could make a difference in people's lives. Balancing academics, family life, and friendships, Holly also maintained a loving relationship with her high school sweetheart. Their bond had grown stronger over the years, and the young couple eagerly discussed their future, imagining a life filled with happiness and shared accomplishments. Though independent-minded, Holly chose to continue living with her parents during her university years, largely because the university campus was conveniently close, just a short drive away. Moreover, their family home carried significant emotional value, as Holly's father had painstakingly built the house himself. Each room, every corner, held precious memories for Holly, making the prospect of moving out unnecessary and even undesirable. On the early morning of April 13, Holly awoke around 4:30 a.m., diligently preparing herself for the day ahead at the university. After a quiet breakfast and a few minutes spent reviewing her notes, she felt ready for class. Shortly thereafter, her parents departed for their workplaces, leaving Holly at home with her brother, who was still fast asleep. At approximately 7:30 a.m., Holly received a phone call from her boyfriend. He planned to go hunting that day on a large piece of property owned by Holly's grandmother and wanted to make sure that her family wouldn't mind. Holly reassured him, and they chatted pleasantly for a few more minutes. With classes approaching, Holly informed him that she'd soon be leaving for the university. Moments after the phone call ended, a nearby neighbor was stepping out of his home, about to start his day, when a sudden, piercing scream shattered the calm of the morning. Alarmed and immediately concerned that something was terribly wrong, he quickly informed his mother about what he'd heard, and she wasted no time in calling Holly's mother. Holly's mother, already at work, instantly felt a pang of anxiety and attempted to reach her daughter by phone. As the calls went unanswered, her fear grew stronger, prompting her to rush back home to check on Holly in person. Inside the Bobo household, Holly's brother remained unaware of the disturbance until the family dog began barking uncontrollably from the backyard. Stirred by the unusual noise, he looked out of his window, initially unsure of what to expect. From his viewpoint, he saw Holly standing in the garage, accompanied by an unfamiliar man dressed in full camouflage attire. Initially, he mistook the man for Holly's boyfriend, as he knew about his earlier plans to go hunting and recalled that he often wore similar clothing. Although Holly's brother couldn't clearly hear their conversation due to the distance, he sensed something wasn't quite right from his sister's tense and worried demeanor. Concerned but still uncertain, he decided to call their mother to clarify if Holly had changed her plans for the day or if she had invited her boyfriend over unexpectedly. However, his mother, frantic with worry, quickly interrupted him and shouted urgently that the man was definitely not Holly's boyfriend. Then, in an alarming and shocking moment, she instructed him to grab a firearm. Initially stunned by his mother's unexpected directive, Holly's brother asked for clarification, to which his mother urgently replied, "Yes," before abruptly hanging up. With growing fear and apprehension, Holly's brother turned back to look outside. His heart sank as he saw Holly walking towards the dense woods bordering their property, the mysterious man gripping her hand firmly. A chilling realization hit him as he noticed the man was significantly taller and broader than Holly's boyfriend. Suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation, he desperately attempted to call Holly and her boyfriend, but neither answered his frantic calls. Meanwhile, Holly's mother had already contacted the police, although the emergency call was mistakenly routed to the neighboring county's authorities due to her location at work. As Holly disappeared into the wooded area, her brother urgently informed his mother of the dire situation before grabbing his weapon and rushing outside to help his sister. Tragically, Holly and the mysterious intruder had vanished from sight, leaving only ominous signs of struggle behind. Upon entering the garage, Holly's brother discovered alarming splatters of blood scattered on the ground, a stark indication of the serious danger she was in. Immediately recognizing the urgency, he called the police again, clearly expressing the severity of the incident and the urgency of their response. Law enforcement arrived swiftly, though the precious moments lost had already allowed Holly's abductor to disappear without a trace. Holly's brother explained to the officers everything he had witnessed, providing details about the stranger's camouflage attire, large build, and the man was also wearing a cap so he couldn't get a clear look at his face. Still, he distinctly remembered that the man had long, dark hair reaching all the way down his back, something quite distinctive and unusual for their small rural town. He also clearly recalled that while he couldn't make out exactly what Holly and the mysterious man were discussing, he could discern that the stranger had a deep, resonant voice, one that seemed calm and authoritative. It gave him an uneasy feeling, heightening his concern even further. When the police arrived, they found the entire situation peculiar and difficult to understand, given the quiet nature of their community. However, they were initially hesitant to launch a thorough investigation, seemingly paralyzed by confusion and indecision. The local police department, being a small-town unit, had minimal experience dealing with such alarming circumstances. They lacked clear protocols or specialized training to manage a case of potential abduction, leading them to uncertainty about how to handle those crucial first hours. Surprisingly, they didn't take immediate action to search the dense woods around the Bobo family home, nor did they properly secure the residence or the garage, despite the disturbing signs they encountered. Alarmingly, officers didn't even promptly speak with neighbors who might have witnessed crucial details. By the time Holly's parents returned home, their anxiety quickly turned to desperation and frustration upon discovering that little real effort was being exerted by authorities to locate their daughter. Only after persistent and impassioned pleas from Holly's distraught family did officers reluctantly begin coordinating a comprehensive search of the wooded areas around their home. They eventually questioned neighbors and invited forensic teams to meticulously examine the blood evidence found in the garage. Crucially, authorities also took steps to conclusively rule out Holly's boyfriend as the perpetrator. It was already clear from Holly's brother's observations that the mysterious man differed significantly from her boyfriend in stature and appearance, and police soon verified through reliable witnesses that her boyfriend had indeed been hunting elsewhere at the precise time of Holly's disappearance. Despite the delayed response, The thorough search of the surrounding forest unfortunately yielded no immediate clues or physical evidence related to Holly's whereabouts. Hoping to make headway, investigators then urgently requested Holly's cell phone GPS data from her provider. The data revealed a troubling and perplexing sequence of movements. Holly's phone traveled northward for approximately 30 minutes before abruptly turning around and heading back toward her family's property. Ultimately, the last known signal originated from a dense wooded location just a short distance from her home. When authorities raced to investigate that specific area, they located Holly's phone, abandoned and deliberately tampered with. The SIM card had been carefully removed, preventing any further tracking. The discovery intensified the search effort, prompting investigators and local volunteers to comb through the area meticulously over several exhausting days. Unfortunately, their tireless efforts provided no additional clues or leads. However, a peculiar phenomenon soon emerged in the community. Residents around town began mysteriously discovering personal items belonging unmistakably to Holly, scattered randomly across public spaces. The first item was Holly's lunch container, inexplicably found abandoned on a street. Then someone uncovered a discarded receipt bearing her name. Shortly thereafter, another resident stumbled upon Holly's university identification card. This unsettling series of discoveries greatly perplexed the community and baffled investigators. Police debated whether Holly herself, in distress, might be leaving these items behind as some desperate plea for help or as markers for potential rescuers. Alternatively, they theorized that the individual responsible for Holly's disappearance was deliberately planting these items as part of a twisted psychological strategy, possibly to confuse authorities or generate fear among residents. With no substantial breakthroughs in locating Holly, police investigators eventually turned their attention toward known individuals with criminal histories residing in the vicinity. Their suspicions quickly focused on a man named Terry, a local resident known to authorities due to multiple previous assault charges. Investigators were startled when they discovered a disturbing pattern. All of Terry's prior victims bore striking resemblances to Holly, specifically in their youthful ages and physical appearance. Terry's physical stature also matched the description provided by Holly's brother, raising immediate suspicion. Driven by these compelling similarities, investigators secured a warrant to thoroughly search Terry's residence and property. However, despite extensive searches, no concrete evidence was discovered linking him directly to Holly's disappearance. Undeterred, authorities subsequently implemented a wiretap operation on Terry's phone, closely monitoring his calls and interactions for several weeks, hoping desperately for a revealing slip or admission. However, these efforts also disappointingly failed to produce any tangible connection to Holly. Authorities persisted, methodically expanding their inquiries to include additional potential suspects and systematically broadening their search radius. Each passing week saw increased volunteer participation from local residents, all driven by collective determination and concern. Unfortunately, even with such unprecedented community involvement, all search operations frustratingly led nowhere. Months passed with minimal progress, eventually prompting police to discontinue ground search operations. They shifted their primary investigative efforts solely towards interrogating suspects, examining alibis, and reviewing extensive case files. Despite sustained efforts, however, these strategies offered no new clarity or breakthroughs in Holly's heartbreaking case. Holly's family, deeply distressed and emotionally shattered, remained trapped in agonizing uncertainty. They felt immense anguish not knowing where Holly might be, her condition, or even if she was still alive. Their grief was compounded by mounting frustration with local authorities, believing fervently that the initial inadequate response from the police had critically diminished chances of finding Holly safely. The family's consistent demands for increased investigative rigor sadly fell short of generating meaningful progress. For nearly 3 long, agonizing years, Holly's tragic disappearance remained unresolved, leaving her community haunted by unanswered questions and painful uncertainty. But in March of 2014, an unexpected and pivotal development occurred. Local authorities arrested a man named Dylan, well known to the police for prior offenses related to illegal substances and possessing unlawful weapons. While being interrogated about unrelated charges, Dylan suddenly and shockingly confessed he possessed crucial information, stating emphatically that he had seen Holly after she had been abducted. According to Dylan's startling account, On the very day of Holly's disappearance, he had traveled to his brother Zach's home to pick up his car. When Dylan arrived at his brother Zach's residence to retrieve the vehicle, he immediately sensed something was gravely wrong. Upon entering the home, he stepped into a scene that would forever haunt him. Standing in the living room, he saw several familiar faces: his brother Zach, another acquaintance, and shockingly, Holly herself. Holly was seated rigidly in an old wooden chair, her posture tense, her eyes wide with unmistakable fear. Dylan later vividly described her frightened expression to investigators, recalling the palpable distress. As Dylan absorbed the shocking scene, his brother Zach allegedly broke the tense silence, casually and chillingly revealing to Dylan that he had kidnapped Holly earlier that morning. Dylan claimed Zach further admitted to having assaulted Holly in unspeakable ways and disturbingly confessed he had recorded the assault on video. Horrified and disoriented by the sudden revelation, Dylan insisted that he did not participate in these atrocious acts. He maintained to authorities that, although he witnessed Holly alive after her abduction, he played absolutely no role in her subsequent murder. He adamantly emphasized his innocence, asserting that his involvement never went beyond the horrific moment of discovering Holly. Dylan also mentioned with chilling specificity that Holly had tragically lost her life shortly after the kidnapping took place, though he vehemently denied witnessing or aiding in her death. He repeatedly emphasized his lack of knowledge about the exact circumstances of her murder, highlighting his confusion and fear at the time. This explanation initially seemed plausible to investigators, but they remained skeptical, continuously pressing for further information. The police investigation took another unexpected twist shortly thereafter. Detectives promptly brought in Zach for questioning, but he firmly denied Dylan's account, maintaining a defiant stance throughout the interrogation. Another strange twist emerged when Jason, their mutual friend, was interrogated by authorities. He recounted going to Zach's home on the day of Holly's disappearance, stating he intended only to purchase illicit substances from Zach, having no prior knowledge or involvement in the heinous crime. Amidst this confusing array of contradictory testimonies, a new witness appeared unexpectedly. A woman approached authorities with a disturbing account of her own. She explained she previously had a relationship with a man named Jeffrey, who had once shown her a disturbing video depicting a violent assault on a young woman. Jeffrey had chillingly revealed to her that the victim in this disturbing recording was Holly Bobo, and the man perpetrating this heinous act was allegedly Zach. Jeffrey's revelation struck her as genuine, as he had specifically named Holly and described unsettling details of the crime, including explicit references to the involvement of Zach. Recognizing this as potentially crucial evidence, detectives swiftly acted upon her testimony. They arrested Jeffrey and another individual closely connected to him for questioning. Both vehemently denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance and claimed to have no knowledge of the video. Police quickly confronted Jeffrey with a recorded conversation between himself and the woman, where he explicitly acknowledged the existence of the video and its horrifying content. When presented with this undeniable evidence, Jeffrey began shifting his explanation, suggesting there had been a misunderstanding due to confusion arising from personal circumstances. He suggested his ex-wife was coincidentally also named Holly, claiming this might have caused confusion during their conversation. While these attempts to confirm Jeffrey's involvement were underway, detectives continued exploring alternative avenues to link their primary suspects conclusively. They diligently pursued leads, hoping to find tangible evidence or compelling testimony against Zach and those connected to him. In doing so, they uncovered another significant lead: a local resident named Shane, who had suspiciously frequent contact with Zach on the day Holly disappeared. Suspecting Shane might have assisted Zach, perhaps even in the grim aftermath of the crime, authorities promptly interrogated him. During his interrogation, Shane became increasingly anxious under intense questioning. Investigators speculated openly that Shane might have aided Zach in disposing of Holly's body, making him a critical figure in unraveling the case. Detectives sought to exploit Shane's apparent fear and discomfort, pressing him relentlessly for truthful answers. Although Shane initially resisted, he gradually provided valuable information. Nevertheless, he fell short of a complete confession or confirmation of his involvement, leaving detectives frustrated yet hopeful. Just when the investigation appeared stalled yet again, an unforeseen development reignited hope. In September 2014, a group of hunters traversing a remote forested area approximately 19 miles from Holly's family home stumbled upon a shocking discovery. Hidden deep within dense brush, they uncovered a large, oddly positioned bucket partially concealed beneath thick foliage. Curious and uneasy, one of the hunters cautiously approached the object. Upon closer inspection, he realized with horror that the bucket contained terrible evidence, immediately prompting them to contact authorities. Police responded swiftly, securing the scene and collecting the remains for forensic analysis. Through meticulous examination, dental records conclusively identified the victim as Holly Bobo. Tragically, the remains had been in the forest for approximately 3 years, severely limiting investigators' ability to gather detailed forensic evidence. Despite these obstacles, forensic specialists managed to uncover a chilling detail. The discovery of Holly's remains galvanized the entire community, reigniting a powerful collective desire for justice and closure. Detectives, recognizing the gravity and complexity of the situation, revisited their extensive notes and interrogations. Soon after, Jason unexpectedly emerged as a key witness willing to cooperate. Under pressure, Jason admitted to detectives that he had indeed been at Zach's residence on the day of Holly's abduction, not for casual reasons, but specifically to purchase illegal substances. His account provided another crucial puzzle piece in the grim narrative that investigators painstakingly assembled. According to Jason's vivid and disturbing account, Zach candidly confessed to abducting Holly, with his brother Dylan and their mutual friend Shane actively participating in the crime. Upon entering Zach's home, Jason found himself confronted by a scene he had never imagined witnessing. The chilling image instantly burned itself into Jason's memory, forever marking that tragic day. Zach, visibly agitated but determined, asked Jason directly for his assistance in disposing of the evidence, expressing urgency in removing any evidence that could link him to the crime. After a brief hesitation, Jason agreed, driven by a sense of fearful complicity and perhaps a misguided sense of loyalty. In a surreal haze, Jason described watching Shane methodically burning Holly's personal items, clothing, identification cards, and other personal effects, in a rusted metal barrel in the backyard. Thick black smoke filled the air, leaving a dark symbolic stain on the afternoon sky. As they stood in anxious indecision, Zach abruptly made the final decision to dispose of evidence in the deep waters below. But before they could carry out their grim plan, they grew fearful of drawing attention. At this critical moment, Zach changed his mind, deciding instead to conceal evidence elsewhere, somewhere more discreet. Jason later recalled Zach's sudden, agitated demeanor as he struggled with the dilemma. With tension palpable in every action, Zach hastily ordered Jason back into the vehicle, and they sped away from the river without executing their initial plan. Several days later, Zach cryptically revealed to Jason that he'd ultimately hidden evidence deep within a secluded area of dense woodland. However, when Jason relayed this information to investigators, it became clear that Zach had either lied or deliberately provided a false location to mislead authorities. Holly's remains were later discovered in an entirely different wooded area, suggesting Zach's attempt at deception. Jason's testimony also presented investigators with troubling inconsistencies regarding the initial abduction scenario. Jason described a narrative wherein Zach, Dylan, and Shane had initially planned to confront Holly's brother at his home under. According to Jason's account, Zach intended to involve Holly's brother in manufacturing illegal substances. However, Holly's brother adamantly denied any interest or involvement in such illegal activities, affirming he'd never associated himself with these suspects. Furthermore, when recalling the morning of Holly's abduction, he maintained that he had only witnessed one person leading Holly away, someone whose description clearly matched Shane rather than Zach or Dylan. This critical discrepancy left detectives puzzled about the accuracy and reliability of Jason's version of events. The investigation further intensified when a local woman unexpectedly came forward, presenting detectives with alarming new evidence. She recounted living with a man named Jeffrey, who had one day ominously shown her a disturbing video clip depicting the assault of a young woman. Jeffrey chillingly identified the victim as Holly and confidently pointed out Zach as the perpetrator, claiming the video had been secretly recorded by Zach himself, as assisted by Jeffrey. Shocked and alarmed by this revelation, the woman willingly provided testimony that opened yet another path of inquiry. detectives swiftly acted upon her statement, promptly arresting Jeffrey and another closely associated individual. Under intense questioning, both men steadfastly denied any involvement or knowledge of the disturbing video and Holly's abduction. Authorities challenged Jeffrey's denials with recorded evidence from his conversation with the woman. Jeffrey, confronted with his earlier statements, suddenly became evasive, suggesting he might have misunderstood the context of her questions. Further complicating matters, Jeffrey introduced the notion of mistaken identity, asserting that his ex-wife coincidentally shared Holly's name, creating doubt and confusion about the legitimacy of the video. As investigators desperately sought concrete evidence, they painstakingly assembled circumstantial proof implicating Zach and his associates. Numerous neighbors provided critical testimonies, describing a white pickup truck speeding away from Holly's property shortly after her disappearance, a truck identical to the one Zach owned. Surveillance footage from local businesses and nearby roads reinforced eyewitness accounts, clearly identifying Zach's distinctive white truck in proximity to Holly's home around the time she vanished. Adding further credence to Zach's involvement, his ex-girlfriend bravely disclosed to detectives that Zach openly admitted his involvement in Holly's tragic fate. Another chilling piece of evidence emerged when a local resident came forward to describe an illicit exchange. The man accepted the weapon, but fearing association with the crime, discarded it into a nearby river. Authorities later successfully recovered the weapon, confirming its connection, although direct forensic links to Holly could not be definitively established. While detectives meticulously pieced together this convoluted web of deceit, another tragic twist abruptly impacted their investigation. Shane Austin, burdened by intense scrutiny and the overwhelming stress of potentially facing severe punishment, was discovered in a local hotel room. His attorney publicly criticized the investigation, accusing detectives of overly aggressive interrogation tactics, claiming that their pressure had directly led to Shane's tragic decision. Finally, the suspects' cases proceeded to individual trials, beginning prominently with Zachary Adams' trial in September 2017, 6 harrowing years after Holly's abduction. Facing intense public scrutiny, Zach pled not guilty. Despite his protestations, Jason Autry's dramatic courtroom testimony vividly recounted his own horrifying experiences on the day Holly disappeared, significantly influencing the proceedings. Faced with mounting evidence and powerful eyewitness accounts, Zachary Adams was ultimately convicted. Subsequently, Dylan Adams, recognizing the overwhelming evidence mounting against him, opted for a plea deal, admitting his partial involvement in the terrible events surrounding Holly's abduction and tragic death. By doing so, Dylan Adams hoped to avoid the full severity of punishment that a prolonged trial would have inevitably entailed. Though Dylan's plea deal did not explicitly require him to testify against his accomplices or provide specific details of the events, it effectively bound him to a narrative that the prosecution could present at trial. Consequently, Dylan was spared a harsher sentence but still admitted his complicity, casting him as an accessory in the tragic events surrounding Holly's disappearance and death. Jason Autry's situation, however, differed greatly. His initial cooperation was vital to the prosecution's case, but troubling questions soon surfaced about the truthfulness and consistency of his statements. Jason Autry initially portrayed himself as a reluctant participant, forced into assisting Zachary Adams after the crime had already occurred. Due to his cooperation, he was initially given leniency, a lesser sentence in exchange for his crucial testimony. Despite the authorities' earlier reliance on Jason Autry's statements, his narrative raised troubling contradictions, fueling public skepticism and debate. The prosecution found itself facing critical scrutiny over the lack of solid forensic evidence directly connecting the accused men to Holly's tragic abduction and death. No fingerprints, DNA traces, fibers, or any other conclusive physical evidence linking Holly to Zachary Adams' car or residence were ever uncovered, despite exhaustive forensic examinations. This glaring absence of direct evidence formed the cornerstone of the defense's argument, leading many in the community to wonder about the reliability of the prosecution's entire narrative. Furthermore, the suspects' families passionately defended their innocence, claiming that investigators had aggressively constructed a false narrative, effectively coercing Dylan Adams and Jason Autry into giving unreliable testimonies under immense pressure. Dylan Adams and Jason Autry accounts notably conflicted, fueling further suspicion about the investigation's thoroughness and integrity. Dylan Adams consistently asserted he never participated directly in the abduction Holly, maintaining his presence was purely coincidental. Contrarily, Jason implicated Dylan significantly, alleging active involvement, a contradiction that severely weakened the credibility of their testimonies. A significant inconsistency further complicated matter. Initially, Holly's brother had clearly described seeing a man leading Holly into the woods, a description distinctly fitting Shane Austen's appearance rather than Zach's or Dylan's. This discrepancy raised additional doubts about Jason's narrative. While Jason mentioned Zach, Dylan, and Shane collectively taking Holly away, Holly's brother steadfastly maintained his statement that only one individual, most closely resembling Shane Austen, had been with Holly. This discrepancy profoundly impacted public perception, causing widespread confusion about what truly happened. Ultimately, the trials proceeded under tremendous public pressure and intense media scrutiny. Zachary Adams was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, plus additional sentences for kidnapping and assault, despite the largely circumstantial nature of the evidence. Dylan Adams was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The police had already searched the farm once before, combing through every inch of the property. However, their initial search turned up nothing incriminating. But now, investigators were back, this time armed with precise knowledge of where the evidence had been destroyed. They sifted through layers of dirt and charred evidence, carefully examining the ashes and debris. Even without a body, the investigators finally uncovered the undeniable proof they needed. By this time, the results of forensic lab tests on DNA samples recovered from the farm had come back. The findings confirmed what detectives had long suspected. The unidentified DNA profile found at the crime scene belonged to Kelsey Berreth. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Today, we're diving into true crime and taking a closer look at the documentary about Kelsey Berreth's case. She was born on September 15, 1989, in the quiet farming town of Moses Lake, Washington. Raised in a rural setting, she spent her childhood on a sprawling family farm alongside her parents and older brother, immersed in the daily rhythms of agricultural life. From an early age, Kelsey displayed a strong work ethic, eagerly helping with everything from tending crops to caring for livestock. However, while she enjoyed the farm work, her true fascination lay elsewhere, in the sky above. She was mesmerized by the crop-dusting planes that soared over their fields, the small aircraft skillfully maneuvering through the air to spray fertilizers or disperse seeds. The idea of flying, of controlling such a powerful machine, captivated her imagination. From that moment on, Kelsey knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. Determined to pursue her dream, Kelsey worked tirelessly through high school, excelling in her studies while continuing to help on the farm. Upon graduation, she wasted no time and immediately enrolled in a local aviation program, setting her sights on becoming a pilot. The rigorous training was demanding, but she thrived under the challenge, displaying a natural talent for flying. After earning her pilot's license, she secured a job as a flight instructor, sharing her knowledge and passion with aspiring pilots. Though her career kept her occupied, she remained devoted to her family, frequently visiting the farm to lend a hand. But amidst her busy schedule, another dream lingered in her heart. She longed for a family of her own, a home filled with love, laughter, and children. By the time she reached 27, Kelsey felt ready to start building that life. In 2016, she turned to the internet in hopes of finding a meaningful connection. That's when she met Patrick, a man whose background mirrored her own. He was a farmer, hardworking and dedicated to the land. And, like Kelsey, he dreamed of having a big family. Their connection was instant, their conversations stretching late into the night as they shared their hopes, their pasts, and their visions for the future. After months of talking, Kelsey made a life-changing decision. She would move to Colorado to be with Patrick. Their relationship had blossomed into something serious, and before long, they were engaged. Shortly after settling into her new life in Colorado, Kelsey secured a position as a flight instructor at an esteemed aviation school that specialized in training military pilots. It was a prestigious opportunity, one that promised career advancement and professional fulfillment. However, the job was located in a different city, about 70 miles away from Patrick's farm. To manage the long commute, Kelsey decided to rent an apartment in a nearby town called Woodland Park. Though the distance meant they couldn't live together full-time, they remained deeply committed to one another, spending every moment they could together. Their love story was unfolding quickly, and within a year, it seemed as though Kelsey had everything she had ever wanted. In early 2017, Kelsey discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy. This was the family she had always dreamed of. A few months later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and for a while, life felt perfect. She and Patrick settled into their roles as parents, and despite the challenges of balancing work and motherhood, Kelsey felt an overwhelming sense of happiness. But soon, subtle cracks began to appear in their relationship. Patrick grew distant, his once affectionate and engaged demeanor shifting into something cold and detached. He no longer seemed excited about their life together, his interactions with Kelsey becoming sporadic and unenthusiastic. She sensed him pulling away, and though she was unsure of the cause, she was unwilling to let go. Determined to salvage their relationship, she made every effort to reconnect with him, hoping that whatever was wrong could be mended. By the time Thanksgiving of 2018 arrived, things between them had grown even more strained. Nevertheless, Kelsey remained hopeful. She planned to cook a special Thanksgiving dinner and called her mother that morning, sharing her excitement about the meal she intended to prepare. During their conversation, she casually mentioned that she was heading to the grocery store to pick up some last-minute ingredients. It was an ordinary, cheerful conversation. Nothing seemed amiss. In the days that followed, Kelsey sent a few text messages to her mother, simple updates about her plans and her baby girl. But then, suddenly, the messages stopped. At first, her mother didn't think much of it. Kelsey was a busy woman. Between her job and taking care of a 1-year-old, it was understandable that she might not have time to respond immediately. But as the hours turned to days and her phone remained eerily silent, unease crept in. A full week had passed without a single call or text from Kelsey, and now her mother was truly worried. Desperate for reassurance, she reached out to Kelsey's older brother, hoping he had heard from her. But he too had received no response. Concern quickly turned to fear. Something wasn't right. Frantic for answers, Kelsey's mother decided to contact Patrick. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. When she finally got a hold of him, his response only deepened the mystery. He claimed that he and Kelsey had broken up. According to Patrick, Kelsey had decided to end their relationship before Thanksgiving. He insisted that on the morning of the holiday, she had dropped off their daughter at his farm, taken some of her belongings, and walked out of his life for good. He claimed he hadn't heard from her since. Kelsey's mother struggled to believe his story. None of it made sense. For one, she couldn't imagine her daughter abandoning her child without so much as a phone call. Kelsey adored her baby. She would never simply vanish. And second, she had spoken to Kelsey on Thanksgiving morning. Her daughter had been in good spirits, excited about cooking dinner, and had given no indication that she was planning to leave. If she had truly decided to break things off with Patrick, why wouldn't she have mentioned it? Why would she pretend everything was normal? Feeling a rising sense of dread, Kelsey's mother pleaded with Patrick to check on her at her home. He agreed, but said he needed to finish up some work on the farm first. But the call never came. Days passed, stretching into an agonizing silence that gnawed at Kelsey's mother. A terrible sense of unease settled over her, and she knew, deep in her gut, that something was terribly wrong. Unable to ignore the growing dread any longer, she made a decision that would set the wheels of an investigation in motion. She called the police. She detailed every concern, explained how out of character this was for her daughter, and pleaded for them to check on her. The local department responded, sending an officer to Kelsey's home. Upon arrival, they found her car parked outside, its presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling. But there was no sign of Kelsey. The officer knocked, waited, and listened. Yet the house remained eerily silent. Since there was no response and they lacked a warrant, they were unable to enter. All they could do was report back to Kelsey's mother that her daughter simply wasn't there. It was a frustrating dead end, but it was just the beginning of a much darker mystery. In an effort to piece together what had happened, officers reached out to Patrick. His story remained consistent. He insisted that Kelsey had told him she needed space and had left. However, this time, he added a new, troubling detail. According to him, before leaving, Kelsey had taken some of her belongings from his house, including a handgun. He painted a picture of a woman who had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her disappearance, subtly implying that she might have been struggling mentally. He claimed he was genuinely worried that she might have done something drastic. Suspicion was mounting, and detectives needed answers. They obtained access to Kelsey's home, and what they found inside only deepened the mystery. Nearly all of her belongings remained untouched. Her clothes, important documents, toiletries, everything a person would take if they were planning to leave. But one crucial item was missing: her car keys. It made no sense. Why would Kelsey take her keys but leave her car behind? The contradiction was glaring, and investigators knew they needed to dig deeper. With this mounting evidence, law enforcement escalated the case, officially launching a missing person investigation. One of their first steps was obtaining Kelsey's phone records to track her last known location. The data they retrieved was baffling. The last recorded signal from her phone came from a small, obscure town called Gooding, located nearly 800 miles away in Idaho. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. When investigators spoke to Kelsey's family, they confirmed what police had already suspected. Kelsey had no connections to Gooding. No family, no friends, no acquaintances. She had never even mentioned the town. It was an inexplicable anomaly, one that made little sense. Officers contacted the local authorities in Idaho, requesting assistance in the search. They canvassed the area, questioned residents, and combed through security footage from nearby businesses. But no one had seen Kelsey. In a town that small, a new face would have been noticeable. Yet there were no reported sightings. It was as if she had never been there at all. The dead end forced detectives to refocus their efforts. Determined to retrace Kelsey's last known movements, police reviewed CCTV footage from the grocery store she had visited on Thanksgiving. The video captured her moving through the aisles with a calm demeanor. She appeared normal, unhurried, undistressed, completely in control. She picked out ingredients for dinner, browsed the shelves, and even bought a single flower before heading to the checkout. There was nothing to suggest she was planning to disappear or that she was under any sort of duress. To investigators, it was clear. Kelsey had intended to return home that night, but she never did. As days turned into weeks without any breakthroughs, Kelsey's family took matters into their own hands. Her mother and older brother flew to Colorado, determined to find her. They moved into her home, hoping that being close to her surroundings might provide them with some sort of insight. Almost immediately, Kelsey's mother was struck by an unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt off, subtly, indescribably wrong. Then, one day, Kelsey's brother noticed something unusual. He had gone to use the bathroom when a small smear of red on the inside of the toilet caught his eye. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but something about it unsettled him. Leaning in closer, he examined it carefully. A chill ran through him as he realized what it could be. He wasted no time. He contacted the police immediately. Authorities arrived and conducted a preliminary test. Their worst fears were confirmed. It was human blood. But that was just the beginning. Detectives realized their initial search had been too superficial. This time, they decided to use luminol, a chemical agent that reveals blood traces even if they have been meticulously cleaned. As the investigators sprayed the chemical, the room told a horrifying story. The bathroom walls and floors lit up in a chilling display. There had been blood everywhere. Though the surface appeared clean to the naked eye, the luminol exposed the unmistakable traces of a crime scene. The same test was performed in the living room, yielding even more disturbing results. Large, smeared stains of wiped away glowed under the chemical reaction, revealing a scene that had been erased from sight. Forensic samples were collected and sent to the lab. When the results returned, they confirmed the grim reality everyone had feared but no one wanted to accept. The blood belonged to Kelsey. But there was something else among the forensic evidence, something that deepened the mystery further. In addition to Kelsey's blood, investigators uncovered 2 additional DNA profiles. One belonged to a man, the other to a woman. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation. Who were these 2 unidentified individuals? What were they doing in Kelsey's home? And, most importantly, what role did they play in her disappearance? At this point, detectives were all but certain that Kelsey was no longer alive. Their investigation shifted focus, from a missing persons case to a probable homicide. The priority now was identifying the 2 unknown individuals whose DNA had surfaced in Kelsey's home. Naturally, Patrick, as the last person known to have seen her, became their prime suspect. Investigators had already been skeptical of Patrick's account of events. His narrative had inconsistencies, and his casual attitude toward Kelsey's sudden disappearance struck them as unusual. Now that they strongly suspected she had been murdered, their doubts about him only intensified. When they obtained access to Patrick's phone records, they found something that stood out. He had continued texting and calling Kelsey's phone up until November 25th, the same day she had stopped responding to everyone else. At first glance, the messages between them seemed ordinary, mostly revolving around their breakup. There were no direct admissions of guilt, no glaringly incriminating details. However, detectives were already questioning the timeline of events. According to Patrick's version of events, Kelsey had left him on Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd. But something about that date didn't sit right with investigators. There was no credible proof that she had been alive in the days following Thanksgiving. No eyewitness accounts, no surveillance footage, and, most disturbingly, no personal activity from Kelsey herself. Her social media accounts had fallen silent. She hadn't contacted her family. Her bank account remained untouched. This raised a terrifying possibility. Kelsey might have been murdered the very night she was last seen. If that was true, then someone had been using her phone to send those messages after her death, possibly as a way to create a false timeline. As detectives combed through Patrick's call records, they noticed something peculiar. He had repeatedly contacted a phone number with a Gooding, Idaho area code both before and after Kelsey's disappearance. Curious to find out more, they traced the number back to a woman named Crystal. She wasn't just some random contact. She was someone who appeared to have a deeper connection to Patrick. Investigators reached out to Crystal and asked how she knew him. She was cooperative at first, explaining that they were business partners who co-owned several horses. But when asked about her last interaction with Patrick, her answers became less straightforward. Initially, she claimed she couldn't remember, but after a long pause, she admitted they had planned to meet shortly after Thanksgiving. According to her, Patrick had asked her to come to Colorado so they could purchase another horse. However, as she was driving there, he informed her that he didn't have enough money to complete the transaction, so she turned around and went back home. This explanation immediately raised red flags. The drive from her town to Patrick's farm was nearly 1,000 miles, a grueling, multi-day journey. It seemed highly improbable that someone would embark on such an exhausting trip just to look at a horse. And then there was another odd detail. Crystal told investigators that she hadn't even used her own vehicle for the trip. Instead, she had borrowed a friend's car, claiming that it was more fuel efficient. This struck detectives as an unnecessary detail, almost as if she was trying to preemptively explain why her own car wouldn't appear on any traffic cameras or toll booth records along the route. Before ending the conversation, detectives asked Crystal a seemingly simple question. Had she ever met Kelsey? Her response was immediate. She claimed she had never met Kelsey in person, but had heard about her on the news. That answer set off alarm bells. At that point in the investigation, Kelsey's case had not yet received widespread national attention. Media coverage was largely local, focused on Colorado. So how had Crystal, who lived in another state, already heard about it? With this new development, investigators decided to take a closer look at Crystal's background. As they dug into her history, they found something that made her even more suspicious. She had recently gone through a divorce. Hoping to gain more insight into her character, detectives reached out to her ex-husband. What he revealed completely contradicted Crystal's claims. According to her ex-husband, Crystal and Patrick had known each other since 2006. They weren't just casual business partners. They had a long history together. Patrick had actually been Crystal's first love, and their relationship had continued on and off for years. Even more damning, he revealed that their romantic involvement had never truly ended, not even after he and Crystal got married. He claimed that Crystal had been secretly seeing Patrick well into 2017, the same year Patrick got engaged to Kelsey. But that wasn't the only lie Crystal had told. Her ex-husband also disclosed that she had lied about her whereabouts after Thanksgiving. At first, she told him that from November 24th to 25th, she had been visiting friends. But when detectives reached out to her, her story changed. She finally admitted to her ex-husband that she had actually been in Colorado during that time. Then, another troubling piece of information surfaced. On December 4th, just days after Kelsey had disappeared, Crystal asked her ex-husband to accompany her to buy a new phone. She claimed that she had lost hers. Detectives immediately took note of the chilling timing. December 4th was the exact same day they had obtained Patrick's phone for investigation. This detail, coupled with Crystal's sudden need for a new device, made investigators even more suspicious. Was she trying to erase potential evidence? Was she worried that her communications with Patrick might incriminate her? With all the evidence mounting, investigators had enough probable cause to obtain a warrant for Crystal's DNA. They flew to Idaho to collect the sample, hoping it would confirm their suspicions. When confronted, Crystal complied with the request but made one thing clear: she would not answer any questions. She was done talking. The cold refusal only reinforced detectives' belief that she was deeply involved in Kelsey's disappearance and likely knew far more than she was letting on. While they awaited the lab results, investigators turned their attention to the car Crystal had borrowed for her trip to Colorado. The vehicle belonged to a friend who was more than willing to cooperate. She allowed them to inspect it thoroughly, explaining that she often carried a handgun inside the vehicle for personal safety. When detectives checked the firearm, they found something alarming. One bullet was missing from the magazine. The friend was adamant that when she had lent the car to Crystal, the gun had been fully loaded. She had no idea where the missing bullet had gone. This seemingly minor detail sent a shiver through the investigative team. Investigators soon reached out to another one of Crystal's acquaintances, a woman named Michelle. What she revealed completely turned the case on its head. Michelle disclosed that Crystal had contacted her in late October, just a month before Kelsey vanished, with a shocking confession. Through tears, Crystal had confided something so disturbing that Michelle had struggled to process it at the time. According to Michelle, Crystal allegedly mentioned that Patrick had requested her help in dealing with Kelsey. He reportedly insisted that he couldn't handle the situation himself, as it would be too noticeable. Instead, he needed someone else to take action, believing that Crystal was the right person for the task. Michelle had been horrified. She urged Crystal to go to the police immediately, but Crystal never did. And now, Kelsey was gone. This revelation completely reshaped the investigation. Detectives now strongly believed that both Patrick and Crystal were involved in Kelsey's murder. However, despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, they still lacked hard proof. No confirmed DNA results, no concrete physical evidence linking them to a crime scene, and most importantly, no body. Without these elements, bringing charges would be difficult. As investigators continued digging for answers, the case took yet another unexpected turn. Out of the blue, Crystal called them and informed them that she had hired a lawyer and was ready to talk. When detectives met with her, she didn't hesitate. She dropped a bombshell confession. Crystal admitted that Patrick had killed Kelsey and that she had helped him cover it up. She explained that Patrick had been thinking about the incident for months, but his original idea always involved her participation. From the very beginning, he had tried to influence Crystal's perception of Kelsey, suggesting that she was struggling and that distancing from her was the best option. Crystal claimed Patrick had pressured her relentlessly, feeding her lies about Kelsey's supposed behavior. At some point, Crystal agreed to help. 2 months before Kelsey disappeared, they devised their first plan. It was meant to be straightforward. Crystal planned to tamper with Kelsey's favorite coffee by adding a substance that would make her feel unwell. But there was a problem. Crystal and Kelsey had never met. To fix this, they created a cover story. Crystal would pose as a new neighbor, someone who had just moved to the area and wanted to introduce herself to the locals. In September, Crystal put the plan into motion. She purchased Kelsey's preferred coffee, drove to her home, and knocked on the door. Kelsey, completely unsuspecting, answered with a warm greeting. They made small talk for a few minutes before Crystal handed her the coffee and casually said goodbye. But there was one major problem. Crystal couldn't go through with it. At the last second, she backed out. She simply wanted to see Kelsey in person, to look her in the eye, and perhaps determine if she truly deserved her fate. And just like that, their first attempt failed. Patrick, however, was relentless. He immediately came up with another plan, one far more brutal. Crystal's new task was to return to Colorado, retrieve a metal pipe that Patrick had set aside for her, and harm Kelsey. She followed through with the first part. She drove nearly 1,000 miles, retrieved the weapon from Patrick's farm, and even parked outside Kelsey's house, ready to complete the mission. But once again, she couldn't do it. She sat in her car for what felt like an eternity, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart racing, and then, in a moment of clarity or weakness, she wasn't sure which, she drove away. Patrick was furious, but he didn't give up. He reworked the plan again. This time, instead of a metal pipe, he left a baseball bat for Crystal to use. The assignment remained the same. Drive to Kelsey's home. Once again, she drove the exhausting distance. Once again, she parked outside Kelsey's house. And once again, she failed. Something inside her simply wouldn't let her cross the final line. According to Crystal's chilling confession, everything unfolded on Thanksgiving afternoon. Kelsey, completely unsuspecting, had no reason to fear Patrick when he arrived at her home that day. He carried with him an air of normalcy, masking the sinister plan he had already set in motion. Holding a small bag, he told her he had brought several holiday-scented candles as a fun way to celebrate the occasion. He suggested they play a lighthearted game. He would blindfold her, and she would have to guess the different scents. The moment Patrick tied the blindfold over her eyes, the facade of playfulness vanished. With calculated precision, he grabbed the baseball bat he had brought with him and, without hesitation, carried out the gruesome attack. Kelsey never saw it coming. He then loaded the container into the trunk of his car as if it were nothing more than cargo. But what he did next was even more disturbing. He went about his day as though nothing had happened. While his relatives gathered around the table, laughing, eating, and enjoying the holiday, Body remained hidden just a few feet away, concealed in the trunk of his car. No one suspected a thing. Patrick acted as if everything was normal, skillfully maintaining his cover. After dinner, Patrick drove to a secluded town called Cripple Creek, where he had already rented a barn in preparation for the next phase of his twisted plan. He left Kelsey there for several days, keeping the situation hidden while he decided what to do next. But he wasn't working alone. That same night, he called Crystal and told her it was time to clean up the mess he had made. Trying to distance herself from any potential evidence, Crystal borrowed a friend's car for the trip. She believed using a different vehicle might throw off investigators if the police ever started looking into her. Before leaving, she gathered an array of cleaning supplies: bleach, gloves, scrub brushes, anything that would help erase the crime. But as she was on the road, Patrick called her again. This time, his instructions were oddly specific. He warned her to be extra careful because he couldn't find one of teeth. He feared it might have flown off during the attack, and the last thing he wanted was for it to turn up somewhere it shouldn't, especially not in front of Kelsey's family. When Crystal finally stepped into Kelsey's home, she was met with a shocking scene. Red stains marked the walls, seeped into the carpet, and even reached the ceiling. The intensity of what had happened in that room was undeniable. She got to work immediately. For over 4 hours, she scrubbed, bleached, and mopped every inch of the crime scene, desperately trying to erase all traces. But some stains were impossible to remove, even with the most potent cleaning chemicals. Feeling overwhelmed, she collected all the soiled items, rags, towels, clothing, and other materials, placed them in garbage bags, and loaded them into her car. When she was finally done, Crystal didn't flee in panic or distress. Instead, she casually stopped at a cafe for a meal before heading to meet Patrick. Her calm demeanor, even after covering up a brutal murder, sent a chilling message to detectives. She had no real remorse. After meeting up, she and Patrick made their next move. They stopped at a gas station where Patrick filled up a canister with gasoline. They then drove to the barn in Cripple Creek, retrieved evidence, and transported them back to Patrick's property. There, under the night sky, they started a fire. Fuel was used to accelerate the process, ensuring that all traces were eliminated. As the flames consumed evidence, Patrick's mother stepped outside. She stood there for a while, observing the fire. Whether she realized what was truly happening remains unknown. Before Crystal left for Idaho, Patrick handed her Kelsey's phone. For the next several days, she took on one last role in the cover-up. She responded to text messages from Kelsey's friends and family, pretending to be her. She kept up the illusion that Kelsey was still alive, skillfully crafting responses that would buy them more time. But eventually, Crystal got rid of the phone, destroying what remained of Kelsey's connection to the outside world. Despite her full participation in covering up, Crystal insisted she hadn't acted of her own free will. She claimed that Patrick had threatened her. She painted herself as a terrified victim who had no choice but to do his bidding. But investigators weren't convinced. Crystal's claims of fear didn't align with her actions. She had numerous opportunities to go to the police, before, during, and after the crime. She could have prevented Kelsey's murder, but she didn't. She had even agreed to kill Kelsey herself on multiple occasions, driving nearly 1,000 miles. And when Patrick finally did it himself, she didn't run. She stayed. She helped him clean up. She disposed of the evidence. She deceived Kelsey's family and friends. At the end of the day, Crystal's confession wasn't motivated by guilt or morality. The truth was far simpler. Her lawyer had advised her to take a plea deal. The deal was shockingly lenient. She would only be charged with a single count of evidence tampering for destroying Kelsey's phone. Despite her detailed confession, police still needed solid physical evidence to bring the case to trial. They had already scoured Patrick's farm once, combing through every inch of the property, but their initial search yielded nothing incriminating. Patrick had been careful, meticulous in covering his tracks. However, with Crystal now cooperating, investigators returned, this time armed with her first-hand knowledge of where evidence had been destroyed. They dug through layers of dirt and charred evidence, meticulously sifting through ash and debris. Despite the lack of a body, investigators finally had the smoking gun they needed. By this time, the lab results from the DNA samples found in Kelsey's home had come back. The results confirmed what detectives had long suspected. The two unidentified profiles recovered from the crime scene belonged to Patrick and Crystal. With nowhere left to hide, Patrick was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. By the time the trial began, investigators had gathered a mountain of evidence against him. One of the most damning pieces came from Patrick's own phone records. Then came another critical detail, one that painted a chilling picture of Patrick's attempts to cover his tracks. After leaving Kelsey's home, his phone records showed that he traveled straight to his farm. But there was one problem. Kelsey's phone traveled with him. He hadn't even bothered to turn it off. By the time the jury deliberated, the verdict was inevitable. The evidence against Patrick was insurmountable. With Crystal's testimony, the phone records, the surveillance footage, and his own incriminating actions, there was no room for doubt. The jury unanimously found Patrick Frazee guilty of murder. he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years for his crimes. As for Crystal, her fate was far less severe. Thanks to the plea deal arranged by her lawyer, she received an unbelievably lenient sentence, just 3 years in prison. But in an even more shocking turn, a judge later reduced her sentence to just 18 months, with the possibility of early release after serving only a year. At some point during the hike, according to his later account, she was either ahead of him or slightly behind him. His version of events changed over time. One moment, they were together. The next, she was gone. He claimed he looked away for a second, and when he turned back, she had vanished. In horror, he said, he saw her body tumbling down a steep ravine, crashing through the underbrush before coming to a sudden, motionless stop far below. A tragic accident. That's how it looked at first. The trail was narrow, dangerous, known for its fatal drop-offs. And yet, something about Ronda's fall didn't sit right. As authorities began asking questions, the details of that day and of her relationship with Stephen became less clear, more unsettling. Why had Stephen's story changed? Why had Ronda, young and healthy, taken out a life insurance policy just months before her death, with Stephen as the sole beneficiary? Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. From the outside, the life that 23-year-old Ronda Casto appeared to be leading in Oregon was not especially remarkable. She was a bright, free-spirited young woman who had grown up in a family that worked hard to stay afloat, navigating the daily challenges of economic constraints and the hopes of finding better opportunities. Her mother, who had to juggle multiple responsibilities to make ends meet, often reminded Ronda of the importance of self-reliance and practicality, values that seemed at odds with Ronda's more carefree temperament. Yet for all her independent tendencies and youthful optimism, Ronda also longed for meaningful connections, both romantic and familial. This yearning often set the stage for decisions that, in hindsight, some would claim were made too impulsively. Still, by the time she met Stephen Nichols, a man 11 years her senior, Ronda was convinced that she had found a partner who could help her achieve her dreams. In the beginning, Stephen struck people as an educated, worldly figure who had traveled extensively. He carried himself with a certain confidence, sharing stories of past business ventures, investment opportunities, and personal triumphs. To a woman in her early 20s, this aura of experience seemed intoxicating. Family members who met Stephen described him as charming on the surface, quick to smile, and ready with an anecdote that showed off his knowledge of eclectic topics: real estate, stock markets, and even international travel. Ronda, who had lived most of her life in the Pacific Northwest, was pulled in by his apparent worldliness, imagining that she, too, might soon be experiencing life's adventures beyond Oregon's borders. Despite these promising beginnings, there were underlying factors that made the relationship more complicated than either Ronda or Stephen might have publicly admitted. Ronda's childhood had not been without its hardships. As a teenager, she struggled with questions of her own identity and worth, looking for validation in friendships and in the occasional romantic involvement. She sometimes confided in close friends that she wanted more out of life than what she saw around her. She wanted financial security, a chance to see the world, and a way to help her family so that her mother no longer had to stretch every paycheck to the limit. In that context, Stephen's presence felt almost like an answer to unspoken wishes. He owned property, or so he claimed, and he had a knack for conversation that made every challenge sound like a stepping stone to something better. When friends teased Ronda about the age gap between her and Stephen, she would shrug it off, saying that maturity was attractive to her. Still, if one pressed her, Ronda might admit that the relationship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. But youthful enthusiasm rarely bows to caution, and she was determined to prove that she could handle any new stage in her life with grace. Early on, Ronda and Stephen settled into a routine that outsiders might have interpreted as domestic comfort. Stephen's apartment, located close to scenic Oregon trails and within driving distance of both cultural attractions and local workplaces, became Ronda's primary residence. Yet some friends noticed subtle changes in her behavior as the months wore on. She became less available for casual outings, often explaining that Stephen preferred they spend time together, or that money was tight despite his outward suggestions of financial success. On more than one occasion, Ronda confided that Stephen could be jealous, though she would quickly follow up by downplaying it. "He just worries about me," she would say, attempting to maintain the image of a caring partnership. Those who were close to Ronda had varying reactions to her new life. Her mother expressed cautious support tempered with concern. After all, Ronda was no longer just an adolescent but a young adult forging her own path. Parents often struggle to find the right balance between respecting their child's choices and offering advice to protect them from potential pitfalls. While her mother tried to remain open-minded, she also noticed that Ronda's phone calls became less frequent. When they did speak, Ronda sounded upbeat and determined to show that everything was fine. Nonetheless, there were small hints of unease in some of these conversations. Maybe a brief mention of an argument with Stephen, or an offhand comment about feeling restless and anxious about the future. These clues were never enough to spark immediate alarm, but they lingered in the back of her mother's mind like puzzle pieces that did not quite fit. Ronda insisted that Stephen had her best interests at heart, especially since he often discussed his ambition to provide a financially secure life. And yet, in the rare moments when Ronda allowed herself to voice her own uncertainties, she wondered aloud if she was ready for the responsibilities that came with merging her life so closely with someone else's, particularly someone with such a strong personality. Stephen Nichols's background, as pieced together by those on the periphery, was multifaceted and somewhat mysterious. He had held various jobs, focusing on what he described as real estate deals and private investments. A few mutual acquaintances, however, privately questioned whether his grand stories of wealth building were entirely accurate. Some claimed that while Stephen had indeed traveled, he might have exaggerated the extent of his success in certain ventures. Still, Stephen's outward persona rarely cracked. He showed confidence in discussing everything from economics to the intricacies of home ownership, and Ronda appeared convinced that he possessed the expertise he claimed. This belief, in turn, was one of the bedrocks of their relationship. Stephen would point to a future in which they would have a comfortable home, a robust financial safety net, and the freedom to explore new avenues, both personally and professionally. Ronda, who had spent her teenage years worrying about whether her family could pay the bills, found this vision deeply reassuring. Yet no matter how dazzling the promises, cracks sometimes appeared. Rumors surfaced that Stephen occasionally asked Ronda to co-sign documents or make decisions she did not fully understand. He might have framed them as necessary steps for building a life together, but it was not always clear if Ronda was aware of the details or felt free to question them. Still, the relationship persisted, and Stephen's knowledge of local nature spots soon became part of the couple's shared pastime. Oregon's scenic beauty, from its dense forests to its majestic gorges and waterfalls, served as a backdrop to many of their weekend adventures. Ronda often posted snapshots to social media, showcasing hikes along popular trails. Although Stephen sometimes came across as controlling to those who witnessed the couple's dynamic in person, insisting on which route to take or how to spend their shared time, the photos portrayed a carefree duo discovering natural wonders. Yet behind these picturesque posts, tensions simmered. There were concerns about money, ironically enough, given Stephen's earlier portrayal of stability. At various times, Ronda hinted that she felt uneasy about their finances. Perhaps Stephen had made riskier investments than he had let on, or maybe he was simply more frugal than she had expected. Friends recalled moments when Ronda backed out of buying new clothes or going on certain outings because she said they were saving up for something bigger. Even more alarming to some was the occasional mention of a life insurance policy. Rumors circulated, perhaps fueled by Ronda's occasional jokes or half-serious comments, that Stephen wanted to secure some form of policy in the event of an untimely death. But at the time, little seemed out of the ordinary beyond the occasional anecdote. When asked, Ronda would either brush off these concerns or simply say that Stephen was being practical, a man who preferred to have a plan for every possibility, good or bad. Meanwhile, Ronda's own aspirations were taking shape. She had once talked about a career in modeling, even dabbling in photo shoots that showcased her vibrant smile and engaging presence. For a while, she was intent on building a portfolio, hoping to land opportunities that might bring her an income while also feeding her creative side. Stephen, initially supportive, would claim he could help her manage that part of her life by putting her in touch with people he knew, or said he knew, who worked in the fashion industry, although no concrete connections ever materialized. Over time, Ronda's modeling aspirations seemed to fade in public view. Some believed that Stephen convinced her it was not a sustainable path, while others speculated that Ronda lost confidence as the relationship became all-consuming. She was also grappling with the reality that she was no longer just a free agent. Much of her time was spent coordinating her life around Stephen's schedule and plans. It was during this period of uncertain transitions that Ronda's close friends noticed a shift in her demeanor. On the rare occasions she did venture out on her own, Ronda spoke in carefully measured tones about Stephen, and sometimes she appeared visibly stressed if she thought she would return home later than expected. Ronda might laugh it off, saying Stephen just liked things done a certain way, or that he felt protective of her in an unpredictable world. And yet, the tension seemed to hover at the edges of every conversation. A reminder that all was not as it seemed in the photographs of sweeping landscapes and smiling faces. Despite these mild warnings, Ronda remained committed to making the relationship work. She often mentioned that Stephen had a strong sense of direction for the future. So when, months into their relationship, Stephen proposed the idea of a short vacation or an adventurous day trip to celebrate life's possibilities, Ronda was typically enthusiastic. After all, this was the sort of spontaneous excitement she had always craved, proof that they were indeed building a life filled with positive experiences. Little did anyone suspect that these routines of hiking and exploring Oregon's scenic wonders were about to become the center of a mystery that would baffle investigators and haunt those who knew Ronda best. On a crisp morning in mid-March, Ronda Casto and Stephen Nichols set out for what was meant to be a refreshing day hike in the picturesque Columbia River Gorge, a destination known for its dramatic waterfalls, winding trails, and panoramic views that draw nature enthusiasts from all over Oregon. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Drive to the Eagle Creek trailhead, park the car, and spend a few hours winding through the mossy forested paths that hugged the edges of steep cliffs and overlooked the rushing waters below. In the days leading up to this outing, Ronda had mentioned to a close friend that she was looking forward to escaping her everyday concerns. Money troubles, relationship tensions, and the general stress of trying to figure out her future, in favor of fresh air and physical exertion. The forecast was favorable, partly cloudy skies with only a slight chance of rain. On social media, the Columbia River Gorge often appears as a scenic wonderland, an idyllic place tailor-made for photographs and gentle treks through nature. Yet, even for experienced hikers, the trails can be treacherous. Narrow lanes carved into steep hillsides, slippery patches of rock, and sudden drop-offs that tumble hundreds of feet into ravines. Ronda was in good physical shape, but she wasn't a seasoned mountaineer by any stretch. Still, hiking was something she and Stephen had grown accustomed to doing together. Friends who occasionally joined them recalled that Stephen enjoyed taking the lead, pointing out interesting foliage or describing the geological features of the region. He presented himself as knowledgeable about local hikes, familiar with which sections were safe and which required extra caution. At first glance, this dynamic might seem normal, even encouraging. Stephen watched Ronda closely as she took in the natural beauty around them. But as they stepped onto the trail that morning, there was a subtle tension in the air that neither addressed outright. Other hikers passed them on the trail, some heading back toward the parking lot with muddy boots and satisfied smiles. At one point, Ronda paused to tie her shoelaces more securely, smiling politely at a couple who were snapping photos of the canyon. Any observer might have thought this was just one more pair of visitors enjoying the rugged splendor of the area. As they progressed deeper into the trail, the path grew narrower. The roar of the creek became more pronounced, echoing against the canyon walls. And though the day was not chilly, the air held a certain damp crispness that felt charged with possibility. Ronda, wearing a light jacket over comfortable hiking clothes, seemed determined to keep pace with Stephen, who moved with a steady stride a few steps ahead. Now and then, he glanced back to see that she was close behind, occasionally offering a hand over a particularly rocky patch or a steep step. Accounts differ as to the exact location on the trail where everything went catastrophically wrong. And for many observers, that ambiguity became a key point of contention in the aftermath. Some recall that the Eagle Creek Trail, though popular, can be deceptive. Certain sections are well maintained and fairly broad, while others consist of little more than a foot-wide path along a cliff edge, protected only by a thin wire or no railing at all. A single misstep in these precarious stretches can lead to a harrowing fall. According to Stephen's story, one that would echo through police reports, interviews, and media coverage in the days and years to come, Ronda was walking just ahead of him, or possibly just behind, depending on which version he provided. They were either engaged in casual conversation or had paused to catch their breath. In any case, Stephen claimed he looked away for what felt like a mere second. When he turned back, he saw Ronda's body plummeting over the edge. He said he shouted, that he tried desperately to grab her, but she slipped through his fingers and vanished. The next moments, by his account, were a blur of panic and disbelief as he rushed to the spot where she had vanished, peering down into the steep ravine. Some versions of his recounting imply that he scrambled down the rocky slope, injuring himself along the way as he tried to reach her. He would later say he was dazed, in shock, and only able to call for help after collecting himself enough to accept that Ronda was lying still far below. Other hikers in the vicinity said they heard panicked yells echoing through the trees, but few actually witnessed the fall. They scrambled to see what had happened, converging near Stephen, who was allegedly shouting for someone to call 911. The scene that followed must have been chaotic. A handful of hikers fishing out their phones to dial emergency services, others trying to locate any sign of movement from Ronda down the ravine, and everyone struggling to keep their footing on a dangerous slope. For those on the higher ground, it was nearly impossible to see the extent of her injuries. She was partially obscured by brush and the natural contours of the terrain. Stephen, appearing visibly shaken, reportedly insisted it was an accident. She had either lost her footing or perhaps slipped on a wet patch. It was a narrative that seemed plausible given the nature of the trail, though the stark finality of a fall that long left everyone in stunned disbelief. Moments later, or so it seemed to those anxiously waiting, local rescue teams were mobilized. The Eagle Creek area, frequented by outdoor enthusiasts, has seen its share of accidents, and the responders who know these trails are all too aware of how perilous retrieval can be. They arrived in specialized vehicles equipped with ropes and stretchers. The hush that settled over the other hikers was tangible, a collective, horrified concern that maybe they had just witnessed one of those freak misfortunes that can occur when nature's beauty intersects with an unguarded moment of distraction. According to a few onlookers, Stephen paced restlessly at the top, sometimes cradling an arm he said he had injured during the descent, sometimes repeating to anyone who would listen that Ronda had simply lost her balance. One detail that would become a point of debate was how calm or distressed he appeared. Some later remarked that his behavior seemed odd, too analytical, perhaps even detached, while others defended his demeanor, suggesting shock manifests in unpredictable ways. By the time paramedics and search and rescue volunteers managed to reach Ronda's position, it was clear there was nothing more they could do. She showed no signs of life, and the fall's brutal force had, by all accounts, been enough to end any hope of rescue. The process of recovering her body from such a precarious spot required both caution and expertise, and it caused a temporary closure of a section of the trail. Other hikers were asked to either wait or carefully turn back, while law enforcement began cordoning off the immediate area where Ronda had gone over the edge. Stephen provided an initial statement on site, repeating that he had witnessed her slip and that her fall was swift and irreversible. The authorities, accustomed to responding to outdoor accidents in the gorge, took the statement at face value but also began following standard procedure, documenting the scene, taking photographs, and noting the impressions of any potential witnesses. In the immediate hours after the incident, there was little to suggest anything other than a tragic mishap. Hikers who left the area recounted the day's events in somber tones, lamenting how quickly a serene outing could turn into heartbreak. The local news, upon hearing of a fatal fall, framed it as an unfortunate reminder of how dangerous the trail could be for those not adequately prepared. But as evening fell and the police listened to Stephen's story for the preliminary report, faint rumors of doubt began to circulate. Tourists wondered how Stephen managed to descend the steep slope so quickly in search of her if, by his own admission, he was not an experienced climber. These questions were small ripples at the time, overshadowed by the pressing reality that Ronda was gone and her loved ones were about to receive the most devastating news imaginable. Back at the trailhead parking lot, emergency responders and law enforcement exchanged information. They spoke with Stephen, who appeared to be in shock, sometimes holding his head in his hands, sometimes grimly insisting that it all happened too fast for him to react. He was transported to a local medical facility for the minor injuries he claimed to have sustained. Along the way, paramedics would later remark, he displayed a range of emotions that veered from despondency to a flat affect. Again, something that could be attributed to trauma or simply to an individual's unique coping mechanism. On the official incident report, Ronda's fall was described as fatal, and an accidental misstep was the presumed cause, pending further investigation. This presumption might have remained unchallenged, but for a handful of circumstances that would soon emerge. Even as the immediate trauma of the day was winding down, a police officer at the scene took note of the inconsistent manner in which Stephen recounted the positions of the two hikers at the crucial moment. Another officer pointed out that Stephen's injuries, though real enough, might not fully align with his story of scrambling down after Ronda. Still, none of these were definitive contradictions, just flickers of doubt that might or might not coalesce into suspicion later. At that moment, the tragic outcome spoke for itself. Ronda Casto, a young woman brimming with life, had fallen to her death on a scenic Oregon trail. The seeds of doubt, the lingering inconsistencies, and the eerie sense that perhaps not all was as Stephen claimed would soon grow into a far deeper inquiry. No one who followed and experienced this tragedy then could have imagined what tangled layers of suspicion, rumors, and legal intrigues would soon envelop this story. In the immediate aftermath of Ronda Casto's fatal fall, local authorities assumed they were dealing with a tragic hiking accident on a perilous trail. Eagle Creek, known for steep drop-offs and narrow paths, had seen its share of mishaps, so first responders followed routine steps, interviewing bystanders, photographing the scene, and trying to determine how Ronda might have slipped. Yet something felt off. Stephen Nichols' statements, coupled with subtle contradictions from nearby hikers, prompted the lead investigator to look deeper. Police officers recorded every detail of the cliff from which she fell. One detective observed a lack of the usual slide marks or footprints that might indicate a struggle to regain balance. Though that alone proved nothing, Stephen's demeanor, alternating between visible grief and sudden calm, raised questions. Traumatic events can produce erratic emotions, but a few responders sensed his behavior might be more than shock. In hushed station conversations, theories emerged. Perhaps Stephen felt genuine remorse, or perhaps he was concealing a larger truth. Once Ronda's remains were moved to the medical examiner's office, investigators began standard interviews, starting with Stephen. He described their final morning as peaceful, insisting Ronda had been walking in front of him when she slipped. He claimed he lunged to catch her, hurting himself in the process, but was too late. Yet his recollection changed slightly with each telling. At first, Ronda was behind him, then ahead. Detectives noted these inconsistencies, even if they might stem from confusion. He also downplayed any relationship trouble, saying they'd had normal disagreements. Still, references to financial strain peppered his account. He admitted Ronda had been worried about money, but he portrayed it as everyday stress. Ronda's mother, devastated, contacted the authorities multiple times. In her tearful calls, she painted Stephen as controlling, though she had little hard evidence. She insisted Ronda would never have ventured so close to a cliff's edge without caution. She also mentioned he'd pushed Ronda to take out a life insurance policy, a revelation that immediately caught the detective's attention. While not inherently incriminating, many couples have policies, it became a puzzle piece. Could financial gain be a motive? Stephen brushed off these concerns in his second interview, calling it a practical choice for their future. Pressed for details, he claimed ignorance of the exact policy amount. Detectives remained wary, unsure whether he was evasive or simply distraught. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's preliminary report listed Ronda's cause of death as blunt force trauma from a fall. Toxicological examination revealed no illegal substances in her system. There were no suspicious bruises apart from those consistent with a high-impact landing. On the surface, the autopsy did not confirm foul play. Still, the coroner left the manner of death as undetermined, hinting that the police had grounds to question the accident narrative. Investigators broadened their inquiry, interviewing Ronda's friends, who described a relationship that seemed happy on social media, but was more tense in private. One recalled Ronda's unease about Stephen's temper. Another noted she felt stifled. Such anecdotes weren't conclusive proof of harm, but they implied emotional turmoil beneath the surface. To verify Stephen's timeline, detectives secured warrants for phone records and online communications. They pored over text messages, social media posts, and call logs from both Ronda and Stephen. Although nothing overtly indicated a violent plan, the texts revealed Ronda's mounting anxiety about finances and a sense that Stephen was pressuring her to sign documents she did not fully understand. As they investigated further, they learned more about Stephen's alleged business ventures, some of which seemed exaggerated. Acquaintances spoke of his controlling tendencies, though no one mentioned outright aggression. Even so, the glimpses of financial stress and emotional strain increased the detectives' suspicions. They then consulted accident reconstruction experts to examine the site. Typically, a slip on loose terrain leaves smears, scuffs, or signs of a last-ditch effort to grab onto branches or rocks. In Ronda's case, the evidence was inconclusive. It could fit both a sudden push or a swift tumble. That ambiguity frustrated investigators, who hoped for something definitive to confirm or refute foul play. As word of Ronda's death spread, local news outlets reported it as a sorrowful incident. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some saw a simple accident. Others believed Stephen had orchestrated a lethal scenario. Detectives tried to avoid the spotlight while they built their case, but they faced increasing public scrutiny. They re-interviewed hikers who saw the couple that day. Most offered only vague impressions. Ronda seemed reserved yet polite. Stephen looked preoccupied. No one witnessed the exact moment of her fall. With only circumstantial pieces, the lead detective worried they lacked enough for an arrest. Yet he felt an unshakable intuition that Ronda's death was no mere accident. Could Stephen have pushed her, or even startled her enough to make her lose balance? Without clear evidence, it remained speculation. In a bid to glean more information, detectives requested another interview with Stephen. This time, he arrived with an attorney who limited his responses. When asked directly about the insurance policy, Stephen repeated that he wasn't sure of its specifics. He then cited his emotional turmoil, saying he planned to move away to start fresh. Afraid he might flee, authorities flagged his name, so they'd be alerted if he left the area. Weeks passed. Officially, the case stayed open, but no definitive ruling on Ronda's manner of death emerged. Investigators compiled statements, phone data, and forensic analyses, searching for a tipping point. Ronda's loved ones grew more distraught, urging the district attorney's office to act. Stephen, for his part, kept out of sight, fueling speculation that he had something to hide. Finally, the police turned their files over to prosecutors. Weighing the suspicious insurance policy, Stephen's shaky accounts, and the tension in the relationship, they debated whether they had enough for a grand jury. If they charged him without solid evidence, the case might collapse. But shelving it felt like a failure to pursue justice if wrongdoing had occurred. Eventually, the district attorney's office decided to proceed. They believed the mounting inconsistencies, Stephen's hazy recollections, the timing of the life insurance, and friends' reports of Ronda's fears, warranted formal scrutiny. Subpoenas went out for financial records, text archives, and any overlooked digital traces. Experts revisited the terrain, hoping to find a missed clue. Tensions mounted as the grand jury date neared. In the weeks that followed the decision to present Stephen Nichols's case to a grand jury, a tense sense of anticipation settled over everyone who had been following the investigation. Investigators, family members, friends, and curious onlookers alike. The district attorney's office prepared its most compelling arguments, organizing the evidence into a narrative that would suggest Ronda Casto's death was no random slip on a dangerous trail. Prosecutors combed through every detail gathered by law enforcement. The suspicious life insurance policy taken out not long before Ronda's fatal fall, the conflicting statements Stephen had given to both police and acquaintances, and the string of small but troubling anecdotes that painted a picture of a relationship more fraught than he had publicly let on. After deliberation, the grand jury indeed returned an indictment, announcing that Stephen Nichols would face charges related to Ronda's death. Police made an arrest and took Stephen into custody. Prosecutors requested a high bail, contending that Stephen was a flight risk. His defense team, led by a determined attorney who had already appeared alongside Stephen in earlier interviews, countered that the case was built on speculation. They insisted he had nowhere to go and no desire to evade the process. He wanted, they claimed, to clear his name and honor Ronda's memory by proving her death was simply an awful accident. Despite these assurances, the judge set a substantial bail amount, reflecting the severity of the accusations. Even so, Stephen eventually secured his release with help from a family member or a private bond company, stepping back into his home as he awaited a formal trial. As pre-trial hearings commenced, the state revealed more of its evidence, including messages from Ronda's phone that hinted at her growing unease. One message to a close friend mentioned big fights about money and a sense that Stephen was pushing her into stuff. Another text, sent days before the fateful hike, expressed a desire to get away for a bit, though she never explicitly said from whom or what. According to the prosecution, these fragments established a pattern of psychological pressure that could have laid the groundwork for a violent act. Simultaneously, there were murmurs that Stephen might consider a plea agreement to avoid the risk of a murder conviction, which carried potentially severe sentences. Perhaps both sides feared the uncertain outcome of a jury trial, recognizing that purely circumstantial cases can hinge on the jury's emotional response as much as on concrete proof. Indeed, the judge had reminded the panel early on that they were to rely on evidence, not speculation, but it was nearly impossible to exclude the emotional dimension of a young woman's life cut short under mysterious circumstances. Eventually, in a startling turn, Stephen's defense team requested a private discussion with the judge and the prosecution. After a lengthy recess, word trickled out that Stephen would no longer face the highest-level charge, likely second-degree murder, but would plead guilty to a lesser offense in exchange for a reduced sentence. The specifics, hammered out behind closed doors, mandated that Stephen accept responsibility for Ronda's death in a legal sense, though he maintained publicly that he had never intended harm. When sentencing day arrived, Stephen, given the opportunity to speak, gave a brief statement expressing remorse for Ronda's death, but still portraying it as a tragic accident. Under the deal, Stephen Nichols received 3 years of probation, with credit for 19 months of jail time. The judge, referencing the complexities of the case and the gravity of the loss, handed down a sentence that involved supervised probation or a similarly moderated punishment. This outcome infuriated some observers, who felt that a life loss demanded a harsher penalty. In interviews given months later, Ronda's mother continued to voice her dissatisfaction, arguing that no punishment could balance the loss of her daughter. Stephen, for his part, tried to rebuild his life away from the spotlight, occasionally releasing carefully worded statements defending his innocence. Dear viewers, what do you think? Was it an accident? In the early morning hours of Sunday, May 10th, 2020, the silence in the Colorado mountains was broken, not by birdsong or rustling trees, but by flashing lights and the gut-deep feeling that something was terribly wrong. Amid the growing panic, on a narrow dirt road, searchers came across something that didn't belong. A bicycle, abandoned, lying awkwardly as if it had been dropped in a rush or with intent. No signs of a struggle, no sound. Mother's Day, a day that should have been filled with hugs and love, had instead fallen silent. Suzanne's phone was silent. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Suzanne Morphew was born in the early 1970s. She grew up in Alexandria, Indiana, harboring a thirst for life that stood out to those who knew her best. Whether through casual conversations in a crowded school hallway or her earnest way of confronting challenges, she had a gift for making people feel supported. She was raised to value human relationships over material success, a principle that defined much of her life. During her teenage years, Suzanne showed an unassuming determination, participating in local sports not because she craved victory, but because she loved the camaraderie. She also found comfort in her faith, regularly attending youth services where her belief in compassion as the foundation of a meaningful life was reinforced. Like many teenagers, she entertained various career interests, teaching, nursing, or something that gave her the chance to care for others. Though she had no clear roadmap, her unwavering urge to help and nurture remained constant. In her 20s, Suzanne received a life-altering diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma, a challenge that taxed her physically and emotionally. Yet even in the throes of treatment, marked by long nights and bouts of fear, she summoned a resilience that would shape her outlook forever. Rising each morning with fresh determination, she framed her illness as a reason to cling tighter to life rather than withdraw from it. When she finally emerged from that difficult chapter, Suzanne carried with her a renewed appreciation for small, everyday wonders. Whether it was the laughter of her children or a brilliant sunrise, she embraced these moments with gratitude, reminding everyone around her how precious life truly is. Not long after overcoming her illness, Suzanne met Barry Morphew, an outdoorsy and energetic individual whose drive seemed to complement her hopeful disposition. Their union produced 2 daughters who became Suzanne's primary focus in life. She delighted in motherhood, immersing herself in activities that ranged from assembling school lunches at dawn to cheering the girls on at sporting events. Friends remember her as a mother who managed to juggle domestic responsibilities with her own personal growth, never failing to show up for her children or for the people in her community. If an acquaintance needed a quick favor, perhaps someone to watch a child, she rarely hesitated to open her home. Over time, Suzanne and Barry decided to move from Indiana to Colorado, beckoned by work opportunities and a shared passion for the outdoors. Colorado's majestic mountains and dense forests seemed like a living postcard, the perfect backdrop for a couple seeking adventure and peace. Suzanne, though grounded in her Midwestern upbringing, discovered tranquility in these new environs. Weekends saw them hiking trails or fishing in pristine lakes, forging memories in the crisp mountain air. Her friends believed that Colorado's open skies mirrored the openness of her heart, vast, warm, and ready to embrace whatever came next. Community engagement was second nature to Suzanne. Even after relocating, she found small yet meaningful ways to contribute to local life. She often volunteered for neighborhood events, organized church gatherings, and extended help whenever she spotted a need. In her new congregation, she became known as a comforting presence, offering empathetic ears to those wrestling with private difficulties. Although her life might have appeared ordinary at a glance, those who knew Suzanne up close recognized the quiet power of her story. She was a cancer survivor who had stared down mortality and refused to become embittered. She learned to welcome change rather than dread it, whether it involved her family's move to a new state or the day-to-day trials of raising children. Having navigated the uncertainties of serious illness, she placed extraordinary value on life's simplest pleasures, from shared conversations over coffee to heartfelt laughter over minor misadventures. Friends would say that she radiated a kind of contentment that stemmed from truly understanding how precious each day can be. Yet Suzanne was not without private worries. The ordeal of surviving cancer left behind emotional complexities, an undercurrent of anxiety for her long-term health, a heightened sense of vulnerability. She rarely let these feelings dominate her outward demeanor, but close friends noted that she sometimes carried a subtle restlessness, as though every moment of calm was balanced against a knowledge of how quickly everything can change. Still, she pressed forward with faith and gratitude, aiming to offer hope to others facing their own battles. Socially, Suzanne favored deeper connections over surface-level interactions. She was not the loudest presence at church events or neighborhood barbecues, but she had a way of gravitating toward people who needed a friend. Of course, no one's life is free from friction. While she rarely spoke about it publicly, Suzanne, like any spouse, faced ordinary marital stresses. Relocation can strain even the strongest relationships, bringing uncertainties related to finances, social circles, and personal fulfillment. From the outside, the Morphew household seemed stable enough, but like all families, they had to navigate the delicate balancing act of career ambitions, teenage responsibilities, and personal aspirations. If Suzanne ever grappled with deeper discontent, she kept it largely to herself, focusing her attention outward on the family she cherished and the community she served. Leading up to the spring of 2020, Suzanne's days were a blend of routine, small celebrations, and personal introspection. She had daughters on the cusp of adulthood, a marriage that had carried her across state lines, and a heart that sought to extend kindness wherever it could find a place. As May 2020 arrived, no one close to Suzanne Morphew could have imagined the storm of mystery and anguish that was about to descend upon the otherwise serene corners of Chaffee County, Colorado. Winter's long grip was finally loosening. Snow was melting off the rugged mountain peaks, revealing lush green slopes and awakening the sleepy earth beneath. Spring was in full bloom, the air scented with pine and fresh promise. With virus casting a long shadow over everyday life, families in the area, like so many across the country, were clinging to routine and small comforts. Against this backdrop, Mother's Day loomed, a day often marked by homemade breakfasts, heartfelt cards, and shared gratitude. Suzanne Morphew, a devoted mother of 2 daughters, likely anticipated something simple and sweet. Hugs from her girls, warm wishes, and the gentle joy of being together. She had built a quiet, contented life centered on her family, her Christian faith, and the scenic outdoors she cherished. But instead of celebration, May 10, 2020, would become forever entwined with confusion, heartbreak, and a baffling disappearance that sent shockwaves far beyond the Colorado highlands. That Sunday began like any other. According to those who knew her best, Suzanne seemed relaxed and untroubled in the days leading up to it. There were no warning signs, no cryptic messages, no late-night phone calls or whispered concerns. Friends and neighbors recalled seeing her out and about, chatting casually about upcoming church services, socially distanced gatherings, or hopeful summer travel plans. She appeared grounded, emotionally steady, and at peace with her surroundings. Her routines were familiar, her demeanor kind and soft-spoken. She was someone who made others feel at ease. The widely circulated narrative would later suggest that Suzanne left her house that morning for a bike ride. A normal, almost ritualistic activity for someone who embraced the outdoors and enjoyed staying physically active. Yet, even this simple premise was soon muddied by unanswered questions. Did she eat breakfast with her daughters before heading out? Was her ride a spontaneous escape or part of a planned route? No witnesses saw her leave, and no surveillance footage captured her path. Sometime between early morning and early afternoon, Suzanne Morphew vanished, seemingly into thin air. By late afternoon, unease was rapidly turning into alarm. Family and friends began calling, texting, and checking in, but their efforts were met with an eerie silence. Suzanne was known for being responsive and communicative, especially with her daughters, who were the heart of her world. Her phone went unanswered. No one had seen her. The house, while tidy, held no sign of her presence. A neighbor, disturbed by the stillness around the Morphew residence and the lack of movement on what should have been a lively holiday, contacted authorities. Officers arrived shortly thereafter, finding Suzanne gone without a trace. Her personal items were still at home, and there was no note, no message, no clue left behind. The investigation began immediately, with search teams deployed across likely routes and popular biking trails. Eventually, her bicycle was discovered near a county road, lying oddly out of place. The discovery only deepened the mystery. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no evidence to suggest a fall or accident. Was the bike carefully placed? Or had someone hastily abandoned it to mislead investigators? If Suzanne had been injured, time was slipping away. And fast. As word of her disappearance spread, the community rallied in extraordinary numbers. Local volunteers fanned out across open meadows, mountain paths, and dense forest groves. Social media exploded with calls for information, while missing person flyers blanketed local businesses and trailheads. A haunting unease settled over Chaffee County, a picturesque enclave now marked by fear, suspicion, and sorrow. The idea that a beloved mother could simply vanish under the clear Colorado sky was too much for many to process. Theories abounded. Some believed a wild animal might have attacked, though no evidence supported such an encounter. Others whispered about a potential abduction, or worse. The possibility that a human predator might be lurking in their midst chilled residents to their core. Law enforcement soon expanded their efforts, bringing in specialized resources from state and federal agencies. As the days wore on with no definitive clues, speculation turned toward Suzanne's personal life. Her husband, Barry Morphew, was reportedly out of town at the time on a work-related trip. His alibi, demeanor, and public statements were scrutinized relentlessly. In one video, Berry appeared distraught, offering a substantial reward for Suzanne's return and pleading with the public for help. Yet online sleuths dissected every word and gesture, some convinced he knew more than he was saying. Others defended him, arguing he was merely a grieving husband caught in a nightmarish storm he couldn't control. Each passing day brought diminishing hope and more agonizing questions. Search teams retraced their steps, re-examining the same creeks, ravines, and hiking paths. Nothing new emerged. No footprints, no discarded clothing, no signs of life or death. Suzanne's daughters, their youthful faces marked by desperation, turned to social media with heartfelt pleas. "Please bring our mom home," one post read, shared thousands of times. The community clung to those words, a fragile thread of hope in an unraveling story. National media descended, drawn by the eerie symbolism of a missing mother on Mother's Day, the family's pain set against Colorado's striking natural beauty. The case quickly took root in true crime circles, spawning podcasts, timelines, theory boards, and amateur investigations. People around the country wanted to know, what happened to Suzanne Morphew? Friends of Suzanne pushed back hard against the notion that she would ever leave willingly. They described her as nurturing, deeply loyal to her family, and spiritually grounded. But whispers of marital discord began to surface. Financial strain, emotional distance, perhaps even infidelity. These rumors simmered beneath the official silence. Despite intense interest, law enforcement remained deliberately cautious in public statements. They acknowledged the baffling nature of the case, but refused to name suspects or rule anything out. Berry Morphew remained a figure of both sympathy and suspicion, depending on who was asked. He painted a portrait of a loving husband fighting to find his wife, but inconsistencies in his timeline and behavior gave critics fuel. His supporters, meanwhile, argued that no one could be expected to act rationally in the wake of such trauma. The official narrative surrounding Suzanne's disappearance had remained nearly unchanged since Mother's Day, and the resulting vacuum of information only deepened the confusion and distress that had already begun to envelop her family, friends, and the community. In those early days of uncertainty, her daughters, desperate for any shred of information, found themselves tormented by the unknown. They clung to hope. Each hour that passed without news, without any indication of what had happened to their mother, weighing heavier on their hearts. The anguish of not knowing was agonizing. In their desperate plea for answers, they called upon anyone who might have even the slightest piece of information to step forward, hoping that even the smallest detail could shed some light on their mother's mysterious disappearance. Looking back, that initial phase of the search was like a cruel and disorienting limbo. It felt as though they were suspended in time, neither confirmation of tragedy nor a sense of relief in sight. Each possibility loomed large and unsettling. Suzanne's community, bound together by years of shared history, camaraderie, and familiarity, longed for closure. They needed something to either confirm their worst fears or bring the possibility of hope. But the brutal reality was that no answers came easily. Strangers, too, found themselves drawn into the story, captivated and perplexed by the enigma of how someone could vanish so completely, leaving behind no trace. However, despite the ebbing of public interest, the investigators' determination remained unwavering. New leads surfaced, offering brief glimpses of hope, and each potential breakthrough brought with it a renewed sense of energy. The cycle of optimism and dread began to take its toll on Suzanne's loved ones. In the quiet of their lives, friends and family found themselves grappling with the idea that maybe, just maybe, the answers they so desperately sought were not to be found. In hushed conversations, whispers about possible hidden motives, secret struggles, or a fateful chance encounter that had gone terribly wrong began to swirl. As the case reached a fever pitch, the public became more and more convinced that something major was on the verge of unfolding. Berry's statements came under intense scrutiny, as did the details surrounding Suzanne's final known moments. Law enforcement, for its part, dug deeper, scouring phone records, financial transactions, and the personal histories of those involved. They combed through every lead, convinced that somewhere in the tangled web of evidence, the truth would emerge. But despite all the mounting pressure, one thing remained undeniable. Suzanne Morphew's absence was not just a personal loss, it had cut to the very heart of her community. The community waited, wondering whether they would ever get the answers they so desperately needed. Publicly, Suzanne's disappearance had morphed into a complex confluence of theories, rumors, and passionate pleas. Yet behind the scenes, law enforcement worked diligently, methodically, and tirelessly to unravel the mystery. The investigation was exhaustive, requiring painstaking attention to detail and, at times, an excruciatingly slow pace. Investigators sifted through a labyrinth of digital trails, witness testimonies, and potential clues, hoping to uncover even a single lead that could break the case wide open. As the investigation unfolded, a wave of professional collaboration descended upon Central Colorado. State agencies, FBI teams, and specialized search units arrived one by one, bringing their collective expertise to bear on a case that had captured the nation's attention. Their presence underscored the gravity of the situation. A mother was missing, and her face, once familiar to many, was now gracing missing person posters across the country. Even in the early stages, law enforcement officials understood that a missing adult case required a distinct investigative approach, one that differed greatly from cases involving lost hikers or runaway teenagers. They knew they had to work carefully, methodically, and, above all, quickly. The first stage of the inquiry focused on establishing a thorough and detailed timeline of the events surrounding May 10, 2020. Investigators turned to every available source of information. The people Suzanne had communicated with, the digital footprints she may have left, the places she frequented, the times of her interactions. Every call, every message, every location was painstakingly reviewed. Surveillance footage, phone records, and any other data that might provide a solid foundation for the investigation were scoured for clues. The process was, in many ways, like attempting to assemble a complicated puzzle from a set of scattered pieces. Each clue had the potential to either confirm or challenge existing theories about what had happened to Suzanne that day. Much of the public's attention understandably focused on Barry Morphew, as Suzanne's husband and one of the last people known to have interacted with her before she disappeared. Barry became a central figure in the investigation. He was immediately scrutinized, as his whereabouts and actions around the time of Suzanne's disappearance were of paramount importance. When Barry stated that he had left town for work on the day Suzanne went missing, investigators focused on determining the exact details of his travel: when he left, when he returned, and where he had been. They pored over GPS data, cell tower pings, and vehicle telematics, each piece of information serving as a potential thread that could either confirm or undermine his account. The public's reaction to Barry's statements was unpredictable and divisive. Some people rallied behind him, believing his story, while others turned on him, convinced that his explanations were flawed or deceptive. As the court of public opinion swung between extremes, law enforcement maintained a calm, disciplined approach. They knew better than to rely on public sentiment or speculative online chatter. They understood that a missing person investigation could quickly escalate into a case of foul play, and they were determined to follow the evidence wherever it led. But they also knew that it would take far more than a few suspicious details or the fervor of online conspiracy theories to build a solid case. In an investigation like this, carpets, floors, door frames, every surface could theoretically hold microscopic signs that might shed light on a possible confrontation or movement of an unwilling victim. Yet, by all accounts, the home offered limited insight. Friends who heard about the house being searched braced themselves for the possibility of a grim revelation. Day after day, however, law enforcement maintained a determined but tight-lipped stance, indicating they had found no definitive proof of Suzanne's fate. Away from the spotlight, a parallel process of information gathering quietly expanded. Search warrants targeting Suzanne's electronics, along with Barry's, were executed. Investigators sought financial records, social media correspondence, and private messages to unearth any hidden conflict or clue about her disappearance. If Suzanne had harbored fears or confided in a close friend, those communications might provide a critical lead. According to people who were eventually interviewed, Suzanne was not known for chronicling personal tensions online. She was quiet, more prone to in-person conversations than to lengthy text rants or cryptic social media updates. This made the search for digital breadcrumbs a painstaking process, less like reading a shocking diary entry and more like piecing together subtle signals spread across months or years. Beyond the immediate family, law enforcement talked to neighbors, friends, church acquaintances, and anyone else who might offer useful fragments of knowledge. Had anyone seen Suzanne on the morning of May 10 beyond the alleged bike outing? Did she mention plans to venture into a more remote area? Had she hinted at marital discord or fear for her safety? These questions, repeated in formal interviews, aimed to capture the intangible sense of Suzanne's life just before everything changed. Over time, these conversations yielded a patchwork portrait. A woman who seemed outwardly content, though some indicated that stresses, like financial pressures or the strains of marriage, could have lurked beneath the surface. While such hints were not uncommon, they provided avenues for detectives to explore, especially when combined with electronic or financial data that might indicate unusual transactions, secret correspondence, or abrupt changes in daily patterns. Simultaneously, the physical search for Suzanne pressed on. Helicopters continued to sweep mountainous regions for any disturbed terrain or hastily concealed site, while trained dogs scoured trails and thick forest undergrowth. Portable sonar systems probed local water sources. Search teams returned to the same areas repeatedly, determined not to miss any subtle evidence. The more time passed, the more potential sites expanded, creating a challenge akin to chasing smoke across the broad Colorado landscape. Chaffee County's rugged wilderness was vast, and the investigators knew that if foul play was involved, the suspect could have exploited these natural expanses to hide critical evidence. Volunteers remained steadfast, still hoping to be the ones to discover the vital clue that would solve the riddle. Yet with every fruitless pass, spirits dipped a little lower. The question many whispered, but few dared say aloud, was whether they were searching for a living Suzanne, or instead for remains that would confirm a heartbreaking outcome. As the investigation proceeded, glimpses of tension emerged around the Morphew family. Those close to Barry expressed belief in his innocence, citing the couple's seemingly solid foundation and Barry's obvious distress. Others, perhaps less certain, saw potential red flags, rumored arguments, occasional sightings that suggested the marriage wasn't perfect, and Barry's sometimes guarded responses. Law enforcement was aware of these background murmurs, carefully evaluating each piece of gossip. They also gathered data from Barry's pickup truck's GPS, fueling ongoing speculation that certain mileage or timestamps might conflict with his stated whereabouts. A few months into the search, even the local news outlets hinted at major breakthroughs, though no arrests were made at that time. In September of 2020, investigators undertook a massive search of a residential construction site linked to Barry's contracting work. The operation spanned multiple days, using heavy machinery to excavate sections of property in hopes of uncovering any sign of Suzanne. Onlookers gripped the edges of their seats, bracing for an outcome that might finally shift the investigation's momentum. Yet when the search concluded, authorities announced no meaningful evidence had been found. It was another setback, both for the professionals deeply invested in this case and for the community longing for clarity. Months had slipped by, and while Suzanne's face still appeared on bulletins, the question of her fate gnawed at the region's collective heart. Behind closed doors, however, the sheriff's office and allied investigators were building a timeline that went beyond the day Suzanne vanished. They meticulously charted phone pings, cross-referenced vehicle movements, and analyzed home security data. They collected personal testimonies about the Morphew household's dynamics in the months leading up to May 10th. They even reviewed the insurance policies on Suzanne's life, searching for any potential financial motive that might cast new light on her disappearance. It's typical in such cases for investigators to explore every angle, from the possibility of a targeted kidnapping to the stark notion of homicide perpetrated by someone close to her. Throughout the winter of 2020 and into early 2021, the public's fixation on the case showed no sign of waning. Some observers pointed to parallels with other high-profile disappearances, weaving in speculation that overshadowed the day-to-day realities of a case that was, at its core, an extensive, detail-driven endeavor. Each new snippet of information, like the alleged discovery of a personal item belonging to Suzanne or rumored expansions of the search perimeter, ignited flurries of commentary on social media. Meanwhile, those close to Suzanne tried to maintain cautious optimism, The sheriff's office issued statements urging restraint and encouraging anyone with credible information to contact official tip lines rather than fan the flames of rumor. Nevertheless, the rumor mill operated without pause. Suzanne's daughters, caught in the crossfire, remained largely private, their occasional appeals for their mother's return overshadowed by the persistent swirl of theories. In the background, investigators continued their painstaking approach. They re-interviewed key witnesses, hoping changes in recollections or new details might surface. They consulted outside experts, including behavioral analysts who examined available statements for potential inconsistencies. This sort of specialized work, often invisible to the public, can heavily influence whether an arrest is ultimately made. If a suspect's story shifts too many times, or if a timeline becomes impossible to reconcile with phone data, law enforcement inches closer to probable cause for a criminal charge. But given that Suzanne was still missing, building a case for homicide without a body presented an especially steep climb. The public crescendo surrounding Suzanne Morphew's disappearance reached new heights in May 2021, 1 year after she was last seen, when Chaffee County law enforcement made a startling announcement. Barry Morphew, Suzanne's husband, had been taken into custody and formally charged with multiple offenses, including first-degree murder. Until that moment, the case was widely viewed as a missing person investigation laden with rumor and speculation, but lacking a firm conclusion. Indeed, the community had been torn. Some stood behind Barry, convinced he was a devoted husband caught up in a baffling tragedy. Others harbored suspicions that his behavior and statements hinted at deeper entanglements. Though investigators stayed tight-lipped, it soon became clear they had assembled a voluminous collection of records. Reports emerged, some in official court filings, others through leaks, about phone GPS logs, text message exchanges, and suspicious timeline gaps. The prosecution aimed to demonstrate that Barry's statements to police contained inconsistencies and, in their assessment, possible falsehoods. Certain digital footprints, for instance, allegedly placed him in locations at times that conflicted with his own account. Prosecutors hinted that the family's finances, as well as prior text messages between Suzanne and close friends, might illuminate a strain in the Morphew's marriage long before Mother's Day 2020. Legal analysts following the case speculated that the prosecution would lean heavily on circumstantial but interlocking pieces of evidence. From the outset, Barry's defense attorney took a combative approach, maintaining that the arrest was hasty and grounded in pressured public opinion instead of definitive evidence. They portrayed Barry as a man who cooperated with investigators, allowed multiple searches of his property, and underwent repeated interviews without requesting counsel. The defense contended that every so-called discrepancy in his timeline could be explained by the stress and confusion of discovering his wife was missing. Barry himself insisted he had nothing to do with Suzanne's disappearance, calling her his angel and claiming that any suggestions of marital discord were exaggerated or rooted in misunderstandings. Over the summer and fall of 2021, a series of preliminary hearings offered the first glimpses into the evidence. Prosecutors revealed fragments of their digital analysis, highlighting phone logs they claimed showed Barry's device switching modes or traveling at hours that didn't align with his public account. Witnesses hinted that Suzanne had confided in a friend about considering a separation, an explosive suggestion that upended the image of a harmonious marriage. Yet, for every revelation, the defense countered with alternative explanations, painting the evidence as circumstantial interpretations rather than definitive facts. Additionally, the question of how exactly Barry might have disposed of Suzanne's remains if he was guilty occupied a central place in the legal arguments. Prosecution witnesses proposed that Barry, working as a landscaper and contractor, possessed the skills and opportunity to hide evidence at remote sites or job locations. On cross-examination, his defense team labeled these theories as pure speculation, unsupported by physical proof like leftover materials, disturbed soil, or eyewitness testimony. Then, in April 2022, almost 2 years after Suzanne's disappearance, the prosecution filed a motion to dismiss the charges without prejudice. The official reasoning cited the unavailability of a key witness, allegedly an expert who could pinpoint evidence in a mountainous region then shrouded by snow, and concern that rushing to trial could hamper their ability to make a watertight case. The motion, granted by the court, allowed the authorities the future option to refile the charges against Barry if new definitive evidence emerged. The Morphew case served as a sobering illustration of how a single disappearance could rattle an entire community, shake institutional trust, and leave lingering questions that might take years to resolve, if they are resolved at all. Even with no active murder charge, the fundamental enigma persists. Suzanne Morphew remains missing.